There is a wooden box in a university basement in Vienna. Inside it is a human skull, and taped to the outside is a yellowed paper label with 4 handwritten words. Skull from Ephesus. No name, no file number worth reading. For most of a century, that box sat on a shelf and almost nobody opened it. Then, in December 2022, a team of scientists took it down, carried it into a scanning lab, and did the one thing nobody had ever been allowed to do. They drilled into the bone, they pulled genetic material out of it, and they sequenced it because for more than 30 years, the world believed that skull belonged to the sister of Cleopatra. That is the closest anyone has ever come to holding the DNA of Cleopatra's own bloodline. The same father, the same palace, the same handful of years. If the skull was who everyone said it would have been the first genetic reading ever taken from the last royal family of Egypt. The results came back and were published in the journal Scientific Reports. They did not confirm the story. They ended it. The skeleton in that tomb was male. The genome carried a Y chromosome, clean, with contamination measured at under 2%. It was not a woman in her 20s. It was a boy, somewhere between 11 and 14 years old, whose skull had fused too early and grown crooked because of it, and whose ancestry did not point to Egypt or to Greece at all. It pointed to the Italian peninsula, possibly Sardinia. A child from the wrong side of the Mediterranean, buried alone in one of the most expensive tombs in the ancient world, in a monument that had been named after a queen's sister for 3 decades. Not a small correction, a complete demolition. The single most famous piece of Ptolemaic bone on Earth was never Ptolemaic at all. So here is where that leaves us. There is no verified DNA of Cleopatra. There is no verified DNA of her sister. There is no verified DNA of her father, her mother, her children, or anyone else in the direct line of the most documented royal family of the ancient world. And yet scientists in the last 8 years have successfully sequenced ancient Egyptians from 1,000 years before her, read their eye color, their hair color, their skin pigmentation, and traced their ancestry across 2 continents. The technology is here, the bodies are not. Which raises the only question that actually matters. Where is she? Because there is a tunnel, 13 meters beneath a ruined temple west of Alexandria, cut straight through solid sandstone for more than a kilometer, half of it flooded with seawater, running in a dead straight line toward the coast. The engineers who measured it called it a geometric miracle. Nobody can explain what it was for. And the woman who found it has spent 20 years arguing that it leads to the only tomb in Egypt that has never been found. 3 things are coming in this investigation. What the genetics of ancient Egypt actually revealed when someone finally read a whole genome. What is at the end of that tunnel? And the reason that even if we opened Cleopatra's coffin tomorrow, the test would still not settle the argument everyone thinks it would settle. Because the problem is not the science. The problem is buried inside her own family tree, and it has been sitting there in plain sight for 2,000 years. Start with the tunnel, because it is the piece you can actually see. 40 kilometers west of Alexandria, on a dry limestone ridge between the sea and a shrinking lake, there is a rectangle of collapsed stone called Taposiris Magna. It was built by Ptolemy II in the 3rd century BC. Tourists stop there for maybe 20 minutes. Most people walk right past it. For most of modern history, it was considered a minor provincial temple, worth a paragraph in a guidebook, and nothing more. In 2004, a Dominican lawyer named Kathleen Martinez petitioned the Egyptian government for permission to excavate it. She was not a career field archaeologist. She had no institutional dig behind her. She funded the first seasons herself, and she told the Supreme Council of Antiquities that Cleopatra was buried there, in a place every Egyptologist had already dismissed. They gave her 2 months. She is still digging 20 years later. What she has pulled out of that ground is not nothing. a necropolis of more than 25 tombs surrounding the temple walls. 10 mummies, 2 of them gilded, which is a burial treatment reserved for people close to royalty, coins struck with Cleopatra's own face and her own name, a headless granite statue of a Ptolemaic king, foundation deposits at the corners of the temple, the ritual plaques that get buried when a sacred building is dedicated, which told her the structure was more important than its size suggested. And in 2022, using ground-penetrating radar, the tunnel. Here are the numbers, because the numbers are the whole story. 1,305 meters long, 2 meters tall, 13 meters below the surface, cut through sandstone, and it does not wander. It runs with the kind of survey precision that only shows up a handful of times in the ancient record. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities compared it directly to the Tunnel of Eupalinos on the Greek island of Samos, a 6th century water channel dug from both ends simultaneously that met in the middle, which is still taught in engineering schools as one of the great achievements of the ancient world. The Eupalinos Tunnel is 1,036 meters long. The one under Taposiris Magna is longer, and roughly a third of the way along, it goes underwater. Not flooded by rain, flooded by the Mediterranean, because the coastline here has been sinking for 2,000 years. For decades, the assumption about tunnels like this was simple: water supply. An aqueduct, a cistern feed, a drainage channel for a temple town. That is the mainstream reading. And it is a reasonable one. Ptolemaic engineers built waterworks everywhere they went. But that explanation has a problem. An aqueduct moves water from a source to a settlement. This tunnel runs from the temple toward the sea, which is the wrong direction for drinking water and the wrong direction for irrigation, because the sea is salt. It has no documented outflow, no reservoir at either end, and no branch lines. It is a single sealed corridor connecting a religious building to the coastline, cut at enormous expense, aimed at nothing anyone can identify. In September 2025, they found out what was at the other end. Martinez brought in Robert Ballard, the ocean explorer who located the Titanic, along with Larry Mayer of the University of New Hampshire, the Hydrographic Department of the Egyptian Navy, and the Underwater Antiquities Division of the Supreme Council. They surveyed the seabed off the ridge. 12 meters down, under coral, they mapped a submerged port. Rows of stone structures standing more than 6 meters high, polished floors, standing columns, cemented blocks, anchors, and amphorae dated to the reign of Cleopatra, scattered where they fell. There is no ancient text that mentions a harbor at Taposiris Magna. Not one. No geographer recorded it, no historian described it, no inventory listed it. A functioning Ptolemaic port with a private tunnel running a kilometer inland to a temple, and the ancient world wrote none of it down. Divers then traced the tunnel's continuation out under the water to a survey point the team designated Salam 5. That is where the passage stops being a mystery of purpose and becomes a mystery of destination. Because a hidden corridor from a sacred building to a hidden harbor is not infrastructure, it is a route. Somebody wanted to move something between the sea and that temple without being seen doing it. There is one more thing the radar found before the tunnel, and it is the reason the excavation ever got a second season. Ground-penetrating radar over the temple platform returned not one anomaly, but a complex of them. A branching set of voids beneath the floor, and within that complex, the survey identified 3 vertical shafts. Shafts, not chambers. In Egyptian practice, a vertical shaft cut down from a temple floor has one common function, and it is not storage. It is access to a burial. All 3 descend below the water table. None of the 3 has been fully emptied. That is also, in fairness, where most of the profession gets off the bus. The mainstream position has always been that Cleopatra was buried in Alexandria, close to her palace, close to the tomb of Alexander, because that is what the Ptolemies did, and that is what the Roman sources imply. Taposiris Magna is 40 kilometers outside the capital. To the standard reading, It is a provincial temple with a rich cemetery attached. And rich cemeteries attach themselves to sacred sites all over Egypt without a queen underneath them. Even so, the permits have been renewed for 2 decades, and the Egyptian Antiquities Authorities have kept publicizing the results, which is not how governments usually treat a theory they have written off. Now, here is where it gets strange, because to understand why she was digging there at all, you have to stop reading the Egyptian religion as poetry and start reading it as instructions. The name Taposiris Magna means, in plain translation, the great tomb of Osiris. For centuries, that was treated as a title, ornamental, the kind of grand religious branding that ancient temples used the way modern institutions use Latin mottos. Osiris was the god of death and of coming back from it, and dozens of Egyptian sites claimed a piece of him. Scholars filed the name under symbolism and moved on. But the myth is more specific than that, and specificity is the thing people keep missing. In the version Plutarch recorded, Osiris is betrayed by his brother. His body is divided into 14 pieces, and those pieces are scattered the length of Egypt. His wife then travels the whole country recovering them, and at each place she recovers, a shrine is founded. That is not a story about grief. Read as a document, it is a distribution list. 14 sites, 1 relic each, a network of sanctuaries that all reference a single body. And the last queen of Egypt did not treat that as folklore. She treated it as a role. Cleopatra publicly identified herself with the great mother goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, the wife in that story, the one who gathers the pieces. She appeared in public in the costume. She took the title in official documents. Her son, by Julius Caesar, was given a name that tied him to the same divine family. She was the first ruler of her entire dynasty after nearly 300 years of Greek kings sitting on the Egyptian throne, who bothered to learn to speak Egyptian. Martinez's argument is exactly this. If a ruler spends her life performing that story in public, then when she dies, her burial is going to follow the same script. Not a Greek tomb in a Greek capital. A tomb in a temple named for the god who dies and returns, on a ridge outside the city, aligned to the myth she had spent a career embodying. The mythology is not decoration on top of the archaeology. The mythology is the site plan, and after 20 years, that is still the strongest reason anyone has to dig where she is digging. If you want more investigations like this, 1. Subscribe. This channel goes deep on the discoveries the textbooks are still catching up to. Because here is what makes the missing body genuinely unbearable now. In a way, it was not 30 years ago. We have finally reached the point where the science would actually work. For a long time, everyone assumed ancient Egyptian DNA was a lost cause. Heat destroys genetic material. Egypt is hot. The mummification process itself involves salt, resins, and high temperatures, all of which shred long strands of DNA into unreadable fragments. Early attempts in the 1980s produced results that later turned out to be contamination from the researchers' own hands. The field, more or less, gave up. Then, in 2017, a team published something in Nature Communications that changed the assumption completely. They took samples from a burial ground at Abu Sir el-Malek in the Nile Valley south of Cairo and sampled 151 mummified individuals spanning roughly 1,400 years, from around 1400 before the Common Era all the way to 400 in the Common Era, straight through the Ptolemaic period and into Roman rule. They recovered 90 complete mitochondrial genomes, and from 3 of those individuals, they pulled genome-wide nuclear data, 3 out of 151. That number tells you exactly how brutal the preservation problem is, and it also tells you the problem is not unbeatable. What those genomes showed was that the ancient Egyptians they sampled shared more ancestry with populations of the ancient Near East, the Levant, and the Eastern Mediterranean than modern Egyptians do. And that modern Egyptians carry meaningfully more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient sample did, a shift the authors traced to movement in the last 2,000 years, which is a polite scientific way of saying something blunt. The genetic map of Egypt has changed since Cleopatra was alive. You cannot work backward from the living to the dead. Then, in July 2025, the ceiling came off entirely. A team published in Nature the first whole genome ever sequenced from an ancient Egyptian. The individual came from New Wayrat, a cliffside cemetery 265 kilometers south of Cairo. He was an adult male. Radiocarbon dating put his death between 2855 and 2570, before the Common Era, bridging the early dynastic period and the Old Kingdom, which means he was alive within a few generations of the building of the first pyramids. His body had been placed inside a large ceramic pot, sealed in a rock-cut tomb. That pot is very likely the reason he is readable at all. It kept him stable while everything around him decayed. They got twofold coverage of his entire genome. And here is what fell out of it. Roughly 78% of his ancestry matched North African Neolithic populations, closest to a Middle Neolithic site in Morocco. The remaining 22% traced to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, to Neolithic Mesopotamia, to what is now Iraq. That is not a small footnote. Archaeologists had argued for a century about whether the shared features between early Egypt and Mesopotamia, the pottery styles, the domesticated animals, the appearance of writing in both places within a few centuries of each other, represented trade or represented people physically moving. Objects can travel without anyone following them. Genes cannot. 20% of a high-status Egyptian's genome coming from the direction of Mesopotamia means human beings made that journey and stayed. They also read his phenotype markers: brown eyes, brown hair, dark skin pigmentation. A man who died before 2500 before the Common Era, and we can now describe what he looked like from the inside of his own bone. So the technology is proven. The method works. Egyptian remains from 4,500 years ago can be sequenced, dated, and read. Cleopatra died in 30 before the Common Era, which makes her more than 2,000 years closer to us than that man in the pot. We are not missing the science. We are missing her. And that brings us to the part of this that nobody wants to explain, because it is not a mystery of geology or chemistry. It is a mystery of paperwork. Go back to Vienna, to the box on the shelf. The octagon at Ephesus is a monument on Curates Street, the main processional road of what was then one of the richest cities in the Roman East. Its architecture borrows from the lighthouse at Alexandria, which is a deliberate and expensive statement about who is buried inside. In 1929, the Austrian archaeologist Joseph Kehl opened the burial chamber and found a sarcophagus filled with water, containing a complete skeleton. There were no grave goods. There were no inscriptions. Nothing named the occupant. Kehl took the skull to Vienna. He left the rest of the skeleton behind. The skull was examined and written up, and in 1953, an anthropologist named Josef Wenninger published his measurements, along with a handful of photographs. He described the individual as developmentally normal, noted no significant abnormalities, and then speculated that it represented what he called a refined type, which he suggested pointed toward high aristocracy. That single unsupported sentence, written by a man looking at a skull with no name attached, is where the legend starts. Then, the skull disappeared into storage and was effectively forgotten for the better part of 70 years. In 1982, a second excavation went back into the octagon and recovered the rest of the skeleton. It was not in the sarcophagus. It was in a niche in an antechamber, moved at some point by someone, for reasons no record explains. In 1990, the archaeologist Hilke Thur proposed the connection formally: the tomb's Egyptian styling, the the date, and the historical fact that Cleopatra's half-sister, Arsinoe IV, had been exiled to Ephesus and had her life ended there in 41 before the Common Era on orders sent from Rome. All pointed one direction. The idea was published, and it stuck. Guidebooks printed it, documentaries filmed it, and in 2009, a research team produced a full soft tissue facial reconstruction of the individual, and it was broadcast internationally as the face of Cleopatra's sister. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. At the time that reconstruction was made and shown to the world, the skull was neither physically nor virtually accessible to the people making it. They were working from Wenninger's published photographs from 1953. A face was built for a woman and shown to millions of people from images of a skull nobody on the team had examined that had been sitting unlooked at in a Vienna collection for over half a century. And that turned out to belong to a boy. It was measured, it was named, it was reconstructed, and it was wrong at every single step. When Gerhard Weber's team at the University of Vienna finally put the actual cranium into a micro-CT scanner and ran the genetics, radiocarbon dating, placed the individual between 205 and 36 before the Common Era. That range does overlap with Arsinoe. Everything else did not. The genetic sex was male. The cranium and the femur from the 1982 recovery were confirmed to come from the same person, which closed the last loophole. The premature fusion of his skull sutures explained the odd shape that Wenninger had read as refinement, and his ancestry pointed to Italy or Sardinia. The published conclusion is careful and it is final. The connection to Arsinoe can be excluded. Her fate, the paper states plainly, remains open, which means the body of Cleopatra's sister is also missing. Two women from the same royal house, two of the most documented deaths in the ancient world. Neither body has ever been located, verified, or tested. Now, does that prove someone is hiding them? Probably not. And this is where the story has to slow down and be honest, because the boring explanation is doing more work here than any conspiracy could. Cleopatra died in Alexandria in 30 before the Common Era. The historian Suetonius records that her tomb, shared with Mark Antony, was left standing and was still being visited generations later. So for a long time, the location was not a secret at all. It was known. Then the city moved. The Alexandrian coastline has been subsiding for 2,000 years, accelerated by two catastrophic events, an earthquake and tsunami in 365 in the Common Era, and another quake in 1303 that finished the lighthouse. The royal quarter, the palaces, the harbor island, the district where a queen's mausoleum would most plausibly have stood, is now underwater. Since 1992, the French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio has mapped substantial portions of that sunken quarter in Alexandria's eastern harbor, working through modern Port Silt in near-zero visibility. Above the waterline, the rest of ancient Alexandria sits beneath a dense modern city of several million people. You cannot excavate a neighborhood. That is very likely the whole answer. Not suppression, not a sealed vault, subsidence, earthquakes, silt, and concrete. And the DNA problem is just as ordinary. 3 usable nuclear genomes out of 151 mummies. 1 whole genome out of an entire civilization. And only because that man happened to be sealed in a ceramic pot. Egypt is close to the worst environment on the planet for preserving genetic material. The odds were always terrible. But that does not make the discovery ordinary, because it means the tunnel at Taposiris Magna is not a fringe theory competing against a solid mainstream answer. It is competing against a site that is underwater and inaccessible. The conventional location cannot be dug. The unconventional one can. And that is where the last piece comes in. The one that changes what a test would even mean. Everyone assumes that if the tomb opened tomorrow and the body inside was hers, a genome would settle the argument about who Cleopatra was. It would not. Not the way people expect. and the reason has nothing to do with laboratories. Cleopatra came from a Macedonian Greek family. Ptolemy, her ancestor, was one of Alexander's generals, and the dynasty he founded ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries while remaining culturally and linguistically Greek. On paper, that makes her ancestry look simple. The family tree is not simple. It is one of the most heavily intermarried royal lines in recorded history. Ptolemy II married his own full sister. It happened again and again. Over generations, the branches of that tree stop branching and start folding back into themselves so that the same few individuals appear repeatedly in different positions. In genetic terms, the pool contracts, and then there are the holes. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was not born to a recognized royal wife. His mother is not named in any surviving source. She could have been a Greek noblewoman from the Alexandrian court. She could have been Egyptian. And there is a serious scholarly case, argued by the historian Dwayne Roller, among others, that she came from the powerful Egyptian priestly families of Memphis, who were the dynasty's essential local partners. And Cleopatra's own mother is not documented either. The most likely candidate is a royal wife of her father's, which would keep the line inside the family. But no surviving text states it. There is no birth record. There is no dedication naming her. Sit with what that means. For one of the most written about human beings in history, a woman whose face survives on struck coinage and whose reign is documented year by year in Greek, Latin, and Egyptian sources. A substantial portion of her own ancestry cannot be named. 2 positions in her immediate family tree are blank, and they are exactly the positions that determine the answer everyone argues about. So a genome would tell you her genetic ancestry with precision. It would not tell you which unnamed woman contributed it, or where that woman came from, or whether she was one person or the product of the same folded-in family the rest of the tree already shows. It would give a number, and the number would immediately start a new argument. There is one more thing worth holding on to. Plutarch, writing not long after her lifetime, noted that Cleopatra spoke the Egyptian language and that she was the first of her line to do so. 9 generations of Greek rulers sat on the throne of Egypt and did not learn the language of the country they governed. She did. She also, by his account, spoke to Ethiopians, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, and Parthians in their own tongues. That is not a genetic fact. It might be the more important one. A ruler who deliberately dressed herself in a country's oldest religion, learned its language, took its divine titles, and built her public identity out of a myth about a body that gets scattered and gathered back together. If the argument is what she was, the DNA would give you a percentage. If the argument is who she was, she answered that herself, in public, for 21 years. And the tunnel is still there. 1,305 meters of hand-cut sandstone, 13 meters below a ruined temple on a dry ridge west of Alexandria, filling slowly with the same sea that swallowed her capital, running toward a harbor that no ancient writer ever recorded. The far end has never been cleared. The chambers, beyond the flooded section, have never been entered. The skull in the Vienna basement is back in its wooden box with the yellowed label that still says Ephesus. And the label is still the only true thing written on it. Somewhere, under sandstone or under salt water, there is a body that would rewrite a chapter of human history. And every year, the water rises a little further into the passage that might lead to it. If you want to see what else the record is hiding, the next investigation is on screen now.